Hey, hey, all you cool cats and kittens. Maybe you've watched Tiger King. Uh, two Tiger King jokes in a row. It's the last lecture. It's the last lecture. This will be really short. I again have added a documentary for you to watch, which I think is actually really good. The one thing that this God in America series does well is politics, because they're really interested in that question. And so you get to see all the stuff. And so what I want to do again, like I did with the last one, is just kind of highlight a few things, and then maybe we're going to highlight fewer things. And I really today is really a story about if we think about the '60s and all those changes that are happening, the civil rights movement, Vietnam War, all sorts of other things that are going on. By the '70s and '80s, there's a pushback and there's a kind of cultural backswing. And we're going to talk about that. And you start to see a new. We're also going to see those folks, those fundamentalists who went and hid and made their own institutions after the Scopes trial, right? They pulled out of mainstream culture and started making their own kind of subcultures. They're coming back, and they're bringing the strength of that subculture with them. So that's where we're headed today, is looking at some of that stuff. Go watch the documentary. It's very good. Make sure you do the readings. And I'm going to try in the next like 10 to 15 minutes to take us from Jimmy Carter to Donald Trump. But I want to just follow a very specific line. And the documentary does a good job. The documentary was filmed in the early 2012, I think is when it came out. So it never saw what was happening in 2016 coming. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end and try to put it in context. All right, here we go. So today's topics, we're going to talk about 60s cultural change. We're going to talk about Jimmy Carter, the disappointment for evangelicals, not in general. I love Jimmy Carter. Met him twice in Atlanta when I was in grad school. The rise of the new religious right, Ronald Reagan, and then quickly talk about George W. Bush and Donald Trump and the differences there. This is not as great as it would be, honestly, if we were in class, because I have a lot of little videos I would bring in, and it's just not feasible in this situation. That's why I'm giving you that full documentary, because it's the next best thing. But if you like today, or you like these questions, I highly recommend you take REL 130, Religion, Politics, and Law, next time it's offered, where we get into some of these questions more. All right, so the 60s, cultural change, hippies, protests. You have the Vietnam War. You have the Civil Rights Movement. You have the beginnings of the LGBT rights movement, although that's not what they called it. You have the threat of nuclear war still. You have the beginnings of the ecology movement. You have all of this cultural upheaval in the 60s, right? And we've seen the civil rights version of that, and it's happening in lots of other areas. And you read about this in the textbook. Make sure you do that textbook reading. That's going to lead to some reaction. And what you see is on more conservative people in the United States, more conservative Christians especially, getting worried and frustrated. And by 1976, you have what many people call the year of the evangelical. So Jimmy Carter, Georgia peanut farmer, running for president as a Democrat, tells a reporter that he's a born-again Christian. And this phrase, born again, becomes really important. In fact, in 1976, you have pollsters start using the question, do you consider yourself born again, when they're asking people about their religion. And this becomes known as the year of the evangelical. Are you evangelical or born again? That question becomes really important on sort of like survey polls and survey data. So the 76 campaign this is a Newsweek article, a Newsweek from 1976, Saturday Evening Post. These are called magazines. People used to read them. These become really important. The question of being evangelical or born again becomes really important during that campaign. And Carter wins in 76. But all of those questions about sexuality, civil rights, the Vietnam War, or at least or war in general, not the Vietnam War, but war in general, that were in the background, a nuclear threat of the 60s, he doesn't answer. Most evangelicals are disappointed in Carter. My dad, not to get too biographical, my dad, who is a self-described evangelical, I remember him telling me that Jimmy Carter was the last Democrat he'd ever vote for. My dad's from Georgia. So that's anecdotal, but I think that's actually representative of a lot of of folks growing up in the late 70s, young people in the late 70s, middle-aged people in the late 70s who turned to Carter and were just disappointed that he didn't deliver for them the way they hoped. He didn't address a lot of their concerns. And so that paves the way right after this for a few figures to come along and start to build new institutions out of the old institutions. So Jerry Falwell, who's pictured here, is the most important, I think. Falwell founds a thing called the moral majority in 1979. And if you think about Falwell, who stood for a particular, this characteristics that we can put down here of the religious way, right? They were white. They considered themselves evangelical or born again. Some considered themselves fundamentalists. They still use that word to describe themselves. They were deeply nationalistic, deeply sort of pro-America, expanding its power. Saw America as connected Christianity and American identity in ways that we've seen before with Protestants. And this kind of nationalist Protestant view that America is a Christian nation, it is a special nation set aside by God to do things in the world. And then special emphasis on reproductive rights, especially abortion. Roe v. Wade is central to this question. The Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion really, and then also questions of marriage and what they would call family values. All of this is happening in this period in the 70s, late 70s, and it hits, and the moral majority is Falwell beginning to take the old fundamentalism, add in a partisan politics, and build this new political dynamo. Other groups that are founded is the Christian Coalition in 1989 by Pat Robertson, the American Family Association. But it's Falwell and the moral majority that gets a lot of the press and becomes really central here. I'm going to pause this again real quick because my child has a question. Hold on. Okay, sorry, I'm back. So that's the new religious right, these groups that are formed. And I think there's a great clip of Jerry Falwell that I found I would show in class if I had time, but where he talks about, we used to be called fundamentalists, and now we're calling ourselves evangelicals. So this leads to 1980 at the presidential election. There you see Ronald Reagan with Jerry Falwell, and I think this sums up a lot of what's going on. Reagan famously, he was at a big convention of evangelical leaders, and he said, you can't endorse, I know you can't endorse me, right, because churches aren't supposed to endorse candidates. There's tax-exempt churches can't endorse political candidates. But he says, but I endorsed you. And Reagan built this coalition of white evangelicals, business leaders, Southern whites, blue-collar Northern and Midwesterners, and out of that was able to form the coalition that got him elected in 1980. Falwell and others thought, this is the solution. Carter couldn't do it. Reagan's going to get rid of abortion. He's going to stand firm on issues of family values. He's going to deliver. And it's important to note with Falwell, and that's what the irony of this picture. During the Civil Rights era, and Falwell had a church in Virginia, Thomas Road Baptist Church, the Southern Baptist minister. Falwell famously preached a sermon on preachers and marching, or ministers and marches is what it's called, where he said that ministers should not be marching in the civil rights marches, that preachers, religious leaders should not be involved in the civil rights movement, that was politics, and religious leaders should stay out of politics. So he says that during the civil rights movement, right, as a white minister of an all-white church in Virginia. And then he turns around in the late 70s and into the 80s and 1980 election and gets deeply involved, right? The moral majority is registering voters who often, many of these conservative, fundamentalists, whatever you want to call them, Christians, at Falwell's churches and others like them around the country, were not registered to vote because they had pulled out. Remember, the fundamentalists had gone home. They weren't doing politics. They weren't doing mainstream culture. And now they're back in the game, and they're getting registered in these large numbers, and they're registering them for the Republican Party, right? And they talk a lot about this in the documentary. Go watch that. They really get into it. But there is this thing where when it's about civil rights for black people, it's politics. But now when it's about power for these particular white evangelicals, it's now about sort of bringing our faith into the political realm is important, right? And I think a lot of what's behind the rise of the religious right is a reaction to the civil rights movement, is a reaction to demographic changes. And there's lots more to be said about that that we don't have time for today. So the religious right during the Clinton years, they really used the Lewinsky scandal as a way to gain momentum. Um, and Reagan still doesn't deliver. After Reagan's terms, um, abortion is still legal, right? A lot of the things that these family values voters, the religious right, whatever you want to call them, wanted, they didn't get delivered. And Reagan himself wasn't an evangelical. He was a California actor. He was a very thoughtful conservative in certain ways, but was not one of them. Right? He was someone that they had found to work with. George W. Bush was one of them. So when George W. Bush is elected, after, my God, what an election that was. After the Supreme Court says he was elected, Bush is a self-described evangelical, right? He's actually a Methodist, but there's sort of an evangelical Methodist. And during the campaign, his advisor, Karl Rove, specifically tried to turn out evangelical voters, right? And they became an important aspect. And if Reagan brought evangelicals, born again voters, whatever you want to call them, into the Republican Party, Rove and Bush cemented that relationship in very, very real ways. He opened the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. And so Bush was a self-described evangelical, brought them into the party, Republican Party, and they became a key constituency for the Republican Party. And as we see, fast forwarding to Donald Trump, 81% of self-described white evangelicals, so that's people who describe themselves as white and then say they're evangelical or born again, 81% of those in 2016 supported Donald Trump. And what's interesting about the Trump situation with evangelicals is evangelical voters make up his strongest base in 2016 and afterward in terms of their sort of support and sort of on approval ratings. Even though he doesn't identify as an evangelical, even though he's lived a life that's incredibly, in many ways, because of multiple marriages and all the other things, flies in the face of so-called family values, right? Has given money to pro-abortion causes in the past, used to be a Democrat, all of this stuff. And what's been remarkable is that the sort of polarization, and there's all sorts of stuff being written about this, and we don't have time to go into all of it, this could be a whole class on itself. But one of the things you see evangelical leaders, there were some evangelical leaders who, never Trumpers, who said following Trump is hypocritical for American evangelicals. But many did not. Many, Jerry Falwell's son, Jerry Falwell Jr., who runs as president of Liberty University, which was the university that Jerry Falwell founded, has been one of the biggest Trump supporters, vocal Trump supporters, since 2016, before and after 2016. And a lot of what you see the leaders say is they compare him to Cyrus, who was a Persian king that rebuilt the temple in the Old Testament. And the argument goes that God can use people who are not part of God's people who are outside, people who might even be seen to be problematic or have done bad things, but he can still use them for his purposes, like rebuilding the temple. And so in some ways, Cyrus made the temple great again, and Trump can make America great again. And so the documentary stops with Obama and this sort of, that you're going to watch, and this sort of, oh, pluralism, yay. And I think it's one way to see this is if the Obama years was a backlash, and many thought Obama was the death blow after Bush to the religious right, Trump shows a swing back, right? There's a bus coming by, it's going to be really loud. But Trump signals a swing back towards, and it shows that if Reagan brought evangelicals so-called self-described white evangelicals into the Republican Party, if Bush cemented them there, then Trump has in this polarized moment further shown that white evangelicals are not going to leave the Republican Party, and they'll find ways to stay connected. That is my baby, if you can hear in the background. So I think I'm time to be done. But that's it. Watch the documentary, read the documents, and I will soon have posted next week the review game that I have for this to help you practice, and then we'll have the quiz. and then this will be done. I hope you all are well. Hope you're trying to find ways to entertain yourselves along with doing your classwork, and stay safe and well. And that's it for the semester. Take care.